Hello and welcome, dear students. Today we are going to discuss an important topic, that is subsurface components of the hydrological cycle. Dear students, the hydrogeological cycle is usually synonymous with the hydrologic cycle, but with a specific focus on the subsurface portion where water interacts with geologic materials. It describes the endless circulation of water between the ocean, atmosphere and land, driven primarily by solar energy. The cycle can be understood through these key components and processes. Let us first discuss the hydrogeological cycle as a system. The hydrologic cycle is a dynamic system composed of reservoirs, places where water resides, and fluxes, processes that move water between the reservoirs. Reservoirs include oceans, atmosphere, rivers, lake, soil moisture, groundwater, ice caps, also called cryosphere, and living organisms called biosphere. Closed system. On a global scale, the hydrologic cycle is treated as a closed system in which the total mass of water remains essentially constant, although energy, which may be sunlight, enters and exits the system. This can be another module, that is system approach section. Now let us discuss subsurface hydrogeologic components. Before we discuss the subsurface components of the water cycle, let us first understand the unsaturated or widowed and saturated zones aquifer. The widowed zone, commonly known as unsaturated zone or the zone of aeration, is a subsurface layer that extends from the ground surface downwards to the water table. Strictly speaking, the widowed zone is a specific area of the subsurface where the pore fluid pressure is less than the atmospheric pressure. Within this zone, geologic materials like soil, sediment or rock usually contain both air and water within their pore spaces. The widowed zone consists of these components and have these characteristics. Soil zone. This is the uppermost layer where infiltration occurs and moisture supports plant growth. This zone is biologically active and facilitates chemical and organic processes that filter contaminants and alter groundwater chemistry. Intermediate widowed zone. Below the soil zone, water exists as a film or coating around sediment or soil grains held in place by surface tension. In this area, the moisture content is less than the porosity, means the pores are partially filled with air, and the hydraulic head is measured using a tensiometer because the pressure head is negative. Capillary fringe. This layer immediately above the water table, where water is pulled upwards against gravity by capillarity or surface tension. A critical distinction in hydrology is that the capillary fringe is technically saturated or the pores are 100% full of water. However, it belongs to the widowed zone because the pore fluid pressure within it is less than atmospheric pressure or negative. This area sometimes referred to as tension saturated zone. The thickness of this fringe varies depending on the pore sizes of the material. Fine-grained materials such as clay poses a thicker capillary fringe than coarse-grained materials such as sand. Capillary rise is the process by which water is pulled upward from the water table against the force of gravity into the pore spaces of soil or rock. The movement is driven by capillarity or capillary force, which results from the high surface tension of water, causing it to adhere to the surface of sediment or soil grains. The saturated zone also known as phreatic zone, is the subsurface region where the wide pore spaces in the rock or soil are completely filled with water. Porosity and permeability are the two fundamental properties of porous media that control the storage and movement of groundwater. While porosity describes the capacity of the rock or soil to hold water, permeability describes its ability to transmit it. Porosity, denoted by N, is defined as the friction or percentage of the total volume of a rock or sediment occupied by void space or pores. It is calculated as N is equal to V voids but a total volume, where V voids is the volume of the voids and V total is the total volume of the sample. Types of porosity. Primary porosity refers to void spaces formed during the deposition of sediment or rock. Example, spaces between sand grains. Secondary porosity develops after deposition owing to processes such as fracturing or dissolution. Example are caves in limestones. Total versus effective porosity. Total porosity includes all void spaces, whereas effective porosity refers only to pore spaces that are interconnected and capable of transmitting fluids. Dead end or isolated pores do not contribute to effective porosity. Porosity depends on the shape, packing and sorting of grains. Well sorted sediments or grains of uniform size generally have higher porosity than poorly sorted sediments, where small grains fill the space between large grains. Theoretically, if the grains are spherical and the packing is uniform, the porosity is independent of grain size. However, in natural materials, packing and sorting cause variations in these properties. Clays typically have a very high porosity, up to 40 to 70%, whereas sand and gravels range from 25% to 50%. Crystalline rocks such as granites have very low primary porosities, often less than 2% unless fractured. Another property is permeability and hydraulic conductivity. Permeability characterizes the ease with which a fluid flows through a porous medium under hydraulic gradient. In hydrogeology, it is critical to distinguish between two related terms: hydraulic conductivity and intrinsic permeability. Hydraulic conductivity, also denoted by K, this parameter describes the rate at which a specific fluid, usually water, moves through the medium. It depends on both the properties of the porous medium and those of the fluid, density and viscosity. Darcy law uses hydraulic conductivity to relate flow rate to the hydraulic gradient, which is also denoted by dH by dL, and cross-sectional area denoted by A. Q is equal to minus Ka dH by dL. Intrinsic permeability K, this is a property of the porous medium alone, independent of the fluid flowing through it. It is determined by the pore size and connectivity. It is related to the hydraulic conductivity by the equation K is equal to small k rho g by mu. Here rho is a fluid density, g is the gravitational acceleration and mu is the dynamic viscosity. This distinction allows hydrogeologists to calculate the flow of fluid other than water, such as oil or contaminants. Now let us discuss factors influencing permeability. One is pore size. Larger pores facilitate easier fluid flow. Consequently, gravels and sands have high permeability, whereas clays, despite having high porosity, have very low permeability because their pores are microscopic and create a high resistance to flow. Sorting. Well sorted materials generally have higher permeability than poorly sorted ones. Variability or heterogeneity and anisotropy. Heterogeneity, permeability varies from location to location within a formation. Example, layers of sand versus clay. Anisotropy, the permeability varies depending on the flow direction. For example, in sedimentary rocks, permeability is often higher when flowing parallel to bedding planes or horizontal than when flowing across vertical. Permeability and hydraulic conductivity are measured using laboratory devices called permeameters or constant head or falling head tests, or through field methods such as pumping and slug tests. Porosity and permeability are the two fundamental physical properties of porous media that control the storage and movement of groundwater, while porosity determines the quantity of water that an aquifer can hold. Permeability determines how easily the water can be extracted or transmitted in unconfined aquifers. The volume of water released from storage or specific yield is physically governed by the actual dewatering of the pores and is essentially equivalent to the effective porosity. In confined aquifers, the specific storage is mathematically defined as a function of the porosity and compressibility of the aquifer matrix and fluid. Porosity is essential for converting Darcy velocity or specific discharge into the actual speed at which water moves. The average linear velocity was calculated by dividing the specific discharge by the effective porosity. The distinction is critical for calculating the travel time of contaminants. The magnitude of permeability dictates whether a formation is classified as an aquifer or permeable enough to yield economic quantities of water, or an aquitard insufficient permeability to yield wells but may transmit leakage. According to Darcy's law, the volumetric discharge through an aquifer is directly linearly proportional to the hydraulic conductivity. Variation in permeability determine regional flow patterns. Spatial variations in permeability cause flow lines to refract at geologic boundaries, often causing flow to concentrate in high permeability zones. If the permeability varies with direction, example, vertical permeability is lower than the horizontal permeability, the groundwater flow directions will be deflected and will not be parallel to the hydraulic gradient. It is important to note that the high porosity does not guarantee a high permeability. For example, clay deposits often have a very high porosities up to 40 to 70%, but very low permeabilities owing to microscopic pore size, making them aquitards rather than aquifers. Conversely, fractured rocks may have very low porosity, often less than 1%, but can pose extremely high permeability if the fracture apertures are wide and interconnected. Together, these two properties are used to drive the parameters like transmissivity, means thickness of an aquifer, and storivity. These are used to evaluate the long-term yield and response of aquifer system to pumping. The key characteristics of the saturated zone includes moisture content. In zone, the volumetric moisture content is equal to the porosity. Fluid pressure within the pores is greater than atmospheric pressure, which means that the pressure heads is greater than 0. Boundaries. The top of the saturated zone is typically defined by the water table, which is the specific surface where the pore fluid pressure is equal to the atmospheric pressure. The lower boundary can be the top of the bedrock. Now let us discuss subsurface components of the water cycle called the hydrogeologic cycle. The hydrogeological cycle involves the movement of water through soil and geological formations. It comprises these components. The first one is infiltration. This is the entry of water from precipitation, snow melt or surface bodies into the subsurface soil or rock. This is controlled by the nature of the subsurface materials. Infiltration is driven by two primary forces, gravity and capillary action. The first is gravity, which pulls water vertically downward through the pores of the soil or sediment. The second is capillary or metric potential. In the vidose or unsaturated zone, water is held to soil grains by the surface tension. When the soil is dry, this capillary force is very strong and effectively pulls water into the soil. The rate at which soil can absorb water is called infiltration capacity. This rate is not constant and changes over the duration of a rainfall event. For example, at the beginning of a storm, when the soil is dry, the infiltration capacity is high. This is because capillary force, surface tension are strong in dry pores, aggressively pulling water into the subsurface. As the soil becomes wet, the capillary forces diminish, causing the infiltration capacity to decrease. It follows an exponential decay curve until it approaches a minimum constant rate known as the equilibrium infiltration capacity. The final constant rate is numerically equivalent to the saturated hydraulic conductivity of the soil. Clay soils with fine pores generally exhibit a more rapid decline and a lower final rate than open textured sandy soils. The relationship between the rate of rainfall or precipitation intensity and infiltration capacity determines whether water is absorbed or flow over the surface. For instance, rainfall capacity, if the rate of precipitation is lower than the equilibrium precipitation capacity, all water will infiltrate and no runoff will occur. Rainfall is greater than capacity if the precipitation intensity exceeds the soil's ability to absorb water. The excess water accumulates on the surface. Initially, this fills small depressions or depression storage in the soil. Once these are filled, the excess water becomes overland flow or runoff. Wetting front is another component. Water infiltration does not instantly saturate the entire soil column. Instead, it moved downwards as a distinct wetting front. A wetting front is a distinct boundary or interface that marks the downward advance of water infiltrating the soil or unsaturated zone. This represents a sharp transition in the moisture content. Behind the advancing front, the soil has a higher moisture content, whereas ahead of the front, the soil remains at its initial lower moisture content. During intense rainfall, the wetting front can effectively act as an inverted zone of saturation originating at the ground surface and propagating downward through the profile. As the wetting front advances downward, it pushes the air ahead of it. This process can trap air between the wetting front and the water table below, and the resulting buildup in air pressure can influence the rate at which the front propagates and cause fluctuations in the water table. This front moved downwards because of gravity and capillary forces. However, as the soil becomes wet and the front moves deeper, the rate of infiltration and consequently the speed of the front typically decreases. Recharge: not only infiltrated water undergoes groundwater recharge. Infiltrating water first replenishes the soil moisture deficit or water held in the soil against the force of gravity. Plants can also extract moisture through transpiration only when the soil moisture content reaches field capacity. the maximum water a well-drained soil can hold against gravity. Does excess water drain freely downwards under gravity to recharge the aquifer? Water that percolates down through the soil and reaches the saturated zone where pore spaces are completely filled with water is classified as a recharge. This represents the inflow to the aquifer system. Once in the saturated zone, groundwater flows through a porous medium driven by hydraulic gradients or differences in fluid energy. Eventually, water leaves the saturated zone through natural outflow such as springs, seepage into the river and lakes, or evaporation, as well as through artificial extraction such as pumping wells in the form of discharge. Evaporation from the water table is a significant groundwater discharge mechanism, particularly in arid regions and areas with shallow water tables. It occurs when water is removed from the saturated or overlying unsaturated zones on into the atmosphere. Can be transferred from the unsaturated zone to the atmosphere via evaporation. If the water table is shallow, capillary action pulls water upwards from the saturated zone into the unsaturated zone and towards the surface where it evaporates. The rate of evaporation from bare soil depends on the depth of the water table and soil moisture conditions. It proceeds in 3 stages. Weather controlled stage is the number 1. In initial constant rate determined by the meteorological conditions or potential evaporation when the soil is moist and conductive. The second is soil profile controlled stage, an intermediate falling rate where evaporation is limited by the soil's ability to deliver water to the evaporation zone. Third one is residual slow rate, a stage in which the surface zone is desiccated and conduction through this zone virtually ceases. There is a physical limit to the depth at which evaporation can occur. This is often quantified using the concept of total evaporable water, or TEW, which is the cumulative depth of water that can be evaporated from the soil layer subject to drying. Transpiration, a specific form of evaporation from the water table, involves vegetation known as phaerotyphites. Phaerotyphites are water-loving plants with roots extending below the water table, unlike other plants that rely on soil moisture. Phaerotyphites directly extract moisture from the saturated zone. The consumption creates distinct diurnal fluctuations in the water table in the discharge area. The water table declines during the day when plants transpire and recovers during the night when plant stomata are closed. Thorough flow interflow. This type of flow occurs when water infiltrating the subsurface encounters layer of low permeability material. This impedes vertical percolation and causes water to move horizontally through the shallow subsurface towards a stream. Base flow. Groundwater provides the base flow to streams, sustaining them during periods of no precipitation. Conversely, surface waters can recharge aquifers in arid regions or where the water table is low. Base flow is the groundwater component of stream flow. It represents the portion of water in a stream or river that is derived from the subsurface saturated zone rather than from direct surface runoff or overland flow. Base flow is the primary mechanism that sustains streams and rivers during periods without precipitation or between snowmelt events, whereas surface runoff responds quickly to rainfall, causing peak in river flow. Base flow provides a relatively stable background flow that maintains river flow during dry weather. Base flow occurs in gaining streams, where the elevation of the water table in the adjacent aquifers is higher than the water level in the stream. These hydraulic gradients drive groundwater through the stream bed and banks into the channel. The water table rises when precipitation infiltrates the ground and recharges the aquifer. This increases the hydraulic gradient towards the stream, thereby increasing the base flow volume. Base flow ceases when groundwater head falls below the riverbed level. This can lead to the intermittent streams where the flow stops entirely during the dry seasons when the water table drops significantly. This was all about today's lecture. Hope you have enjoyed it well. Thank you for watching.